He wasn't interested.
I think it's just so we can refer back if we have any questions and things like that. Thanks, Julie.
So, Rebecca, do you want to say anything or we'll jump in?
Yeah.
Oh, do we have to wait till the live streaming?
Yeah, 5:30. Pedantic.
There's no agenda, Ricky.
So, Dion,
an old
once,
agenda.
we're finished tonight. Can you
Oh, that's
flick
just the
this
old,
through for the
the
elected
last
members?
agenda, I think, that they've got.
That's so the final draft you said the other day.
Yeah, which is the same as this one. Yeah.
Yeah. Thing. Are you there yet? Not yet. Almost there.
We'll keep you here in a minute, don't worry.
Better than a treadmill minute. I'm sure.
Feels more like a plank.
Oh yeah, could be.
So,
Beautiful. All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here on a Monday night. We'd like to welcome Corinne, who is with us tonight from Haynes Norton. In attendance, we've got Rebecca, our CEO, Dion, our Deputy CEO, and we've got Julie from Finance, and all of our councillors in attendance. So thanks, Corinne. I'm going to handle the back.
yes, thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mayor Hannah. So I'd also like to welcome you, Corinne. I think it's going to be a really interesting meeting for all of us to discuss rates and not only what we're looking at now, but how that can impact the transition through to capital value rating in 12 months or so's time. But I'll hand over to you if that's right. Oh, just so you all know, Corinne's got a very lengthy background in local government and rating, auditing councils and the like, so she's well versed in this subject.
Thank you. I actually started in councils in 1984. And a whole bunch of councils that don't exist now after amalgamations, but and I worked in councils up until 2012 when I moved to UHY, and now do it from a different perspective. So today we are going to get an understanding of your rating system, because you've got a very significant thing that's going to happen to you by law, and that is you're going to be forced to move from your current site value to capital value. So we're just going to chat about that and what that's going to look like, so that you can start to understand how you might bring this in over the next period, couple of years. I'm happy for you to ask a question at any point as we go through. The slides are really here to make us have points of discussion and to give us a bit of a background. So the first thing that we need to understand about rates is that rates are not a fee for service. They're a tax. They're a property tax. And as such, in theory, the higher the value of the property, in theory, the higher the wealth of the person, and therefore the more capacity they have to pay. We know that that's not exactly true. Someone with a high valued property may have no money. They might have been there for 50 years and all the values of the property around them have gone up. We also know that with site value, some of this wealth tax concept is actually diminished. But underlying everything, rates are a property tax. Your legislation, you'll get us a copy of these slides. Legislation, if you go there, Chapter 10 of the Local Government Act, it's an entire chapter, is all about rates. The regulations then give you a little bit more information, but they're the two legislation pieces that manage rates in local government in South Australia. Every state has its own local government act, and every state manages rates quite differently. South Australia has one of the most complex rating systems in the country. So there's chapter 10. Basically, there are some principles of rating. So your principles are that it's a system of tax, as we've mentioned. So when someone says, I don't get my money's worth out of my rates, well, I don't get my money's worth out of my income tax, but my kids went to uni, my parents are on the pension, the community that I'm involved in gets the money's worth. So it's not a direct response from your tax, but someone does get the community gets the money's worth. Rating has to provide a system of relief. So if there are situations where there is hardship or where there is reasonable situations for rebates, in the Act, it allows you to do a whole range of things in that area. So, and I know that examples exist in local government in South Australia over the last few years. We have had councils who've got rebates for relief of COVID, for business, relief of drought, relief for flood, relief for fire, anything you like. There's actually a lot of capacity to do things within that area. The other principle behind it is you must take into account your future years. So you can't set rates so low that the public are really happy, but you're setting the council up into the future to not have enough money to particularly manage assets and therefore creating an unsustainable situation in the future. So these are the principles that are enshrined in this legislation. As well as that, there are principles of taxation. Now you can Google principles of taxation and come up with a whole raft of different things, but predominantly these tend to be the common ones. One is equity. So equity means that I don't pay the same tax as you. That's not equity. Equity means that if I earn more, I pay more tax than you. Doesn't sound like equity, but that's what equity means. Benefit, you may not get a direct benefit, but there is a benefit from your tax. Ability to pay. So your taxation system, your rating policy, needs to take into account the ability to pay. Now, that's not very easy. So where we do it in local government is hardship provisions and rebates, as we discussed, but we haven't got lots of ability to mould that area, but it is where we look at properties and the wealth of them. The moving from site to capital actually nails this, because site, what we had when we had site value is the little old lady that lived in a little shack on the foreshore for the last 50 years, and the property's worth $100,000, not these days. And the mansion next door should not be paying the same amount of rates. At the moment, they are, which is why the state government is forcing the move from site to capital. Efficiency. A tax must be efficient. If you put a tax on to stop someone doing something or to make them do something, it needs to work that way. So where that relates to local government taxes, rates, is you might have vacant land at a higher rate in the dollar, because you don't want people holding large amounts of vacant land. You want them to release that land, to sell it, to create building. You might have commercial properties. You want to increase more shops in the town. So you might have a lower rate in the dollar for those properties to encourage that. A rate is efficient if it actually does what you meant it to do. So I had a council that had a strategic goal of increasing township shops and increasing development. But their rating structure over time had become such that it went completely against those goals. So it wasn't efficient, it wasn't doing what the council needed it to do. And simplicity. It needs to be a tax that makes sense, that's easy, that works, that is collectible. Now, as complicated as rates are, they do make sense. They are easy to collect, and they're hard to avoid. So that's what you want with a tax. Now, rates are very important for councils. They're the majority of the income that councils get. And you need to have a policy. It doesn't have to be a separate policy. It can be as long as it's within your annual business plan. But you need to have a policy statement on how you're setting the rates, how you're doing rate rebates and concessions. Really, we don't have concessions anymore, so it's rate rebates. What methods of payment people can do, and advice for postponement for seniors. I don't know whether you're aware of this, but seniors over 60 who are seniors in the definition within the Act, which is over 60 working less than 20 hours a week and so forth, can postpone a portion of their rates every year. They still pay interest, they don't pay fines, but there's a system there, and then when that property's sold, whether they move on to aged care or they die, and the property's sold, council gets its rates back. So that's something, it's not an area that has been used very much. If I go to every council and they all go, how many have you got? Yeah, none. People don't actually are not aware of it. So as elected members, this is something, if an older person is struggling, this is an option that will help. And this might be very important as we're moving from site to capital, we start to see what the effect on those people's rates are going to be.
What kind of rate is something like that?
So the interest rate is set as in the Local Government Act with a percentage on top. So it's higher than council incurs when they borrow money. So council is always going to be able to cover allowing for this because the money we borrow through the LGFA is at a lower interest rate. So it's a standard rate. The rate works out at the moment at 4-something%. I think 5.2 at the moment.
Just on that, is financing debtors to the LGFA a challenging thing, or is that?
Financing rates debtors,
Yeah.
the LGFA will lend you money according to your rates of income. So it's not an issue. The trick that becomes a problem is that after 3 years, if somebody, and I'm not talking postponement here, I'm talking someone who's not paying their rates. After 3 years, if they haven't paid, council can sell the property. Now that sounds well and good, but if you're in an area where you've got some very low value properties, so I can tell you Elliston had some properties that after 2 years were worth less than the rates that were owed. So in those kind of areas, and I don't know whether you've got that kind of property here, you just have to be a little bit cautious about that. Most council districts don't have that problem. The value of the properties are so much more than the rates. There is a whole process to go through. If anyone is needing to go through it, I always suggest they go to their local government lawyers because it's a complicated process to go through to ensure you do that correctly. When I was at Yankalilla Council, we were involved in a rates, almost got the largest Section 184 rate sell-off ever with Warina, which had 84 properties that owed 250,000 in rates, but they paid at the last minute, which they didn't. So we did become history making. But it's just to be aware that that option is there. I know a lot of elected members become very concerned about rates being unpaid, but unless you've got properties that are worth less than those rates, it's actually the best investment you're going to get. It's actually, you're covered. So it's not something to panic about. You certainly want to keep them rolling along, but in the case of postponement, even if all your older people turned out tomorrow and said, we want to postpone rates, it wouldn't be a financial detriment to council. Council would do it. So then we have rate structures, which also has to be in your rating policy statement. Capital versus site, but of course, after 2023, there's no choice in that. Everyone is capital. Fixed versus minimum. You currently have fixed, which means $712, I think, is set first. Then the value of the property times the rate in the dollar after that. Only 50% of your properties can have their income coming from fixed. So 50% of your rate revenue can be fixed. You can't have more than that. The other way you can go is minimum. And minimum means my rate in the dollar times by the value of my property. If it's below the minimum applies. If it's above, the calculation applies. In both cases, contiguous properties are not set to fixed charges or to minimum rates. So if I've got a house and I've got a block of land next door, and I own both, I'll only get the fixed charge in your case on one. If I'm a single farm enterprise and they don't even have to be next to each other, so I'm a farmer and I've got one here, one there, paddock over there, and they're all the same entity, I only get one fixed charge. All right? So fixed or minimum.
Why is it discriminatory against people in residential? They have probably B, and farmers can do that, even though it's a farming enterprise. You could have a person have unit B,
But
in the
needs to
same
be-
structure.
Needs to be occupied by.
Yeah, it's occupied by the same. But the
Oh,
idea of
yeah.
it is, so if I've got a house and another property next door which is like garden,
Yeah, I understand.
whereas if I have a house and another house over there, I've got two complete different business.
So you've actually got to
situations.
occupy
Yeah.
the land.
And with the farmers, properties could be everywhere. It's all part of the same farming enterprise.
They often have a house on each of those.
Yes.
And
And so it can become a little complicated. So some farmers have gone to avoid tax or to make estate planning or whatever reason, I'm going to have, this is owned by F. Smith, this is owned by D. Smith, that's owned by K. Smith. They're not occupied by the same entity, they don't get that relief from the fixed charge. They get a fixed charge for each.
But if they're all farmed by the same entity, they get fixed.
Yeah.
Only one fixed charge. But if
If they're farmed
Son,
by,
daughter, and they're all farming that, then you get the exemption.
How do you get on there and say, nowadays, most people buy farms and they don't want houses, but they put someone in there renting it. Does that change the actual?
no, because the house itself, it's the majority of the occupation. The house itself is this big and the property is this big, so it's the majority of the occupation. So the farm is actually all paddocks. Yeah. Believe me, rating is not perfect, and there's a whole lot of, oh, but that's not fair. You're right. There's a whole lot of those as we go along, but this is the rating structure we've got that we have to live with.
So if I had I've got a residential, I had a block of land, had a house in Tunbridge Bay, house here, I've had my wife and that man, that one, the daughter, and that one, is that better?
Well, who owns them all?
Family trust.
Family
Family
trust.
trust,
They've got to be next to each other. Yeah,
that's what's
So-
discriminatory against,
yeah.
residential against rural.
So it wouldn't pass in that case. Fixed, only 50% of the rate revenue can come from fixed. Minimum, only 35% of your properties can be on the minimum rate. Differential means that you've got different rates in the dollar for different situations. You have a combination of locality and land use. Locality is where you are on a map. Land use is what you use the property for. So there's different ways to do it. There's a whole lot of different mixes. On another slide, I've got the percentage of councils that use all different types of mixes with that. And growth, okay, so growth is if I have a vacant block of land and I put a house on it, at the moment and in history past, that was growth. If I have one block of land and I subdivide it and turn it into two, that was growth. Once the new reform comes in, one block of land turning to two, still counted as growth. A vacant block of land turning to a house is no longer counted as growth. So where you look in your long-term plan and councils say CPI plus growth, we can no longer count that house being built as growth. So, which is not really a very useful way to look at that. It's probably not affecting you guys too much, but Mount Barker is going through angst over this, as you can imagine. There's a lot of development going on, a lot of houses being built, and they can't count that as the extra money they can get.
Just going back to the differential with the land
Yep.
use. The land use changes. What's stopping you from putting a different rate on that property?
So the land use is set by the VG department, the Valuer General Department. Council gets notified of the land use. So if a council uses land use only, they are informed what land use it is. They rate according to the land use. Now, people can make an objection to the VG and go, I don't actually use it for this, I use it for that. And the VG will look at that and tell council what their decision is. But if the land use can change, so you can go from vacant to residential, where you put a house on it. You can go from primary production to residential if you do subdivisions and you just got a block with a house. You can go from, depending on your planning laws, you might go from residential to commercial.
So, probably should define it better. If you go to land use where you haven't defined that land use as a rating in your policy, can you just go and rate on that as a different land use or not?
No, that comes to, well, you can, but you've got to do a rate review process. So at the moment, you've got a mix of land uses and locality. If you wanted to move to just locality or just land use or a difference in that, you have to go through a rate review process to do that.
The dump. I'm not telling you what to do tonight. You've been
So a
20
rate review
years.
process, we do come to it later, but a rate review process, under the legislation, a rate review process requires at least 3 weeks consultation. But I can
As with the
tell
public.
with the public, but I can tell you that with all the rate reviews I've been involved in, it takes months, because number one is the elected members have to understand what possibilities they are and come to a consensus of what they think is going to work. Then you do a whole, in that process, you do bucket loads of modelling. You're constantly going back and going, if we did this, what would that look
Yeah,
like? How
okay.
would these be affected?
Sorry, this is only one land use company is doing this rubbish stuff.
So
The regional rubbish stuff.
the regional rubbish dump is currently commercial.
So it's
is it?
commercial, it's commercial industrial.
Yeah.
I think it's industry heavy or whatever it is.
Yeah.
We only have a rate at this stage, differential rate for all commercial industrial
Yeah.
properties.
Yeah.
So what Councillor Laurie is getting at is we could potentially add a category, a differential just for that particular category. But that would then pick up all properties that have got that particular
And you would have to
category.
do a rate review.
And in this case, there's
There's only
that would only
one
be
property
two.
Doesn't
for a
matter.
regional dump. I
Yeah.
realise the rate review, but
Yeah.
it's not going to pick up anyone else.
Well, that's what you've got to be careful of, because you've got a bulk handling zone.
Yeah, well, that's something
Yeah.
else. Bring it back.
So, which is fine, lots of air peninsula have and quite a few councils have. But I know when Coorong brought in the bulk handling zone, they had to look at everything that was going to be in that bulk handling zone, because it's a zone, it's a planning zone. And they found there were properties that council owned, so that's not a problem. There were properties that state government owned, so that wasn't a problem. So they could go ahead with putting it into that, into a different rating category. So bulk handling zone turned out to be quite simple, but you have to be very, very careful that anything you look at with changing that, if you go by locality, which is a zoning, you've got to look at anyone in that zoning that's going to be affected and then go, is this the effect that I expected and that I planned for and that I wanted? Have I picked up a property that happens to be in that zone but is a house, and am I now unfairly rating it? So there might only be one in that zone, so you can look at it. Two, and what is the other property?
That's a dysfunctional fish farm facility.
So it's still commercial.
It's only, but only a portion of the property. It sits in two zones in actual fact. as
Oh,
opposed to
okay, just
less.
to complicate things.
Yeah.
So you can do those things, but you've got to go through a rate review, even if you're only affecting one property.
Yeah, I understand that. You just really was talking about it's done because there was only one regional done
Yeah.
on Air Connection, and we seem to have it. But you can't compare it, I suppose, that rubbish done, it's not regional. There's a regional.
So one of the big issues with land use, I mean, there's a whole lot of issues with locality as well. An issue with locality is that a locality that is township, which you've got, towns grow over time, and you might have property A getting rated as a township, property B getting rated outside the township, and they're next to each other. So it starts to become complicated as you go along. Land use is simpler and it's clearer. It's on the actual use of the land rather than where it is. So when you look at land use, it's still not a perfect system. So if I look at commercial, I can have commercial shop, commercial office, commercial other. I can have industrial light and industrial other. That's it. When I look at primary production, I can have primary production. I can't have intensive farming. I can't have grapevines. I can't have feedlots. And each of those farming entities is quite different and has a marked difference on your road system and demand on council services. But we can only rate by, if you go land use, you can only rate by residential, commercial shop, commercial other, commercial shop, office and other, industry, industry light, primary production, vacant and other. That's it. Doesn't allow for wind farms, electricity producing places. It doesn't allow any of those variations. There's currently a paper that's been done by the Legatus Group, which is the central region down York Peninsula and up through to Port Pirie, where they've gone, you know, we really need to have something more flexible around, particularly private production, intensive versus broadacre farming, for instance. At this point, it hasn't got anywhere because there's got to be a legislation change because your land use is in your regulations. So, now, locality ran into a few problems 2 years ago when the whole planning zone system changed. And I know councils with locality had a little bit of a struggle with some of those things. You've obviously got through that now, but that would have been an issue a couple of years ago. I know a couple of councils that just went, we're going land use because this is not going to make it too hard to make sense of for us. So that's the systems that we can use. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, yeah.
Very not yet, okay. If you don't have a separate rates policy, you have to include these rate principles, policy principles in your annual business plan. I always recommend that it is worthwhile having a rates policy that then is attached to the business plan because you can see there's quite a lot that can be in a policy that you discuss, and particularly if you're going down special rebates and all kinds of things like that. So your rates generate 57% of your income. So they are very significant to in the amount of money you get. Some councils that is much higher, not many are too much lower. Your grants is pretty reasonable. Some councils that's really tiny. But
That's only because we've had a lot of RCLIP grant fundings.
yeah, okay. So this will change every year, this makeup.
We're very much.
And
on
so
the
that was
lower
all that kind of grant funding, was it?
end. Yeah, we're very much on the lower end as far as.
So you'll see then, as that grant funding fades off, you'll see this graph become more and more in the blue and less in the red over the next few years. So what we're saying here is that rates are significant. So we need to get them right. They're so significant, the state government is now doing an oversight system for them through a SCOSA, which has got a whole lot of other issues to worry about. But it's important to get the rating system as good as you can in your council to fit the needs of your council. You don't have to do the same as next door. You don't have to do the same as 5 councils over. You don't have to do the same as Adelaide. You have to do what works for your council. So we discussed this a little bit in the different ways that you rate. So when we look at the rate in the dollar, which is the value we multiply against the value to get the rates after we've levied the fixed charge, you have township, which is not commercial, industry and others, so it's actually residential within townships. And we use that as the base. So we say that's 100%. You have outside of townships, which is only 39% of residential. That picks up all the primary production. We have bulk handling, and I'm not sure you realise that that rate in the dollar is 1,474% of the rate in the dollar used for your residential properties, which is pretty high. And we have commercial, industry and other. And as you can see down here, this is what other councils do. So 58% are on land use, 21% are like you, a mix of land use and locality. 11% have no differential, all have a differential where everything is set at the same rate in the dollar. 10% have locality only. Now this percentages up here, oh, I've got to point it. Look, these percentages up here have kind of morphed over years. I'm not sure that that was necessarily your original principle that you were going to charge bulk handling 1,474% of the rate in the dollar for. Okay. Anyhow, over the years, because you said you've had a principle that if there was a 3% increase in rates, each of these sections, categories, would have a 3% increase in the rates that they produced. Wakefield Council had exactly the same system, but over the years, properties changed from one category to another, like township, outside of township, commercial, and what they ended up with was a wildly different, as maybe you have, to what their original principles were, whatever they were, and they no longer worked for what they were trying to do. So what I always suggest with councils is consider your strategic goals and then align your rating principles to your strategic goals. Do you want more shops? Okay, then commercial shops, at least being lower rate in the dollar, might be right. Do you feel the dump is having a major impact on the costs of council? Then commercial other might be a higher rate in the dollar. Do you have a whole lot of vacant land and you want people to build on them? Then you might have vacant land at a higher rate in the dollar. Do you have no vacant land and you want developers to create vacant land? Vacant land might then be a lower rate in the dollar. So you can use rating as a tool to help you achieve your strategic goals. At the moment, I'm not sure this is achieving your strategic goals. I'm definitely not sure that it's aligned to your strategic goals. So it's something to think about.
The biggest problem was been happening this for 7 or 8 years. 7 or 8 years ago, the rural and the residential rate were the same. And
Same rate in the dollar.
Same rate in the dollar 7 years ago. That was the council today. 7 rural councils there on it. They decided to lower the rural rate. And that's the problem how that's happened.
Yep,
Exactly
and
that.
it may no longer be relevant to what you're trying to achieve. So you've now got an opportunity, you're forced to go from site to capital in the next couple of years. Now is the opportunity, and I'll get to timing of it, but I'm not saying now as in today, but this budget you're doing now, I'm saying the next 12 months is the opportunity, the prime opportunity to look at this, deep dive into it and go, what actually works best for our council? The reason I'm not saying today is you do not have time. You do not have time to really work out the complexities of what's going on. Get everyone on the same page, go out to the community and really look at it properly with them this year.
You can change the rate of dollar.
Slightly.
How much?
Not a lot. It can't impact any particular group in any significant way without a rate review.
Fixed charge, I'm pretty sure the fixed charge came in at the same time. Around
Oh,
the
mine.
same time, and the fixed charge is basically what balanced that over time,
Your fixed
And that-
charges are actually quite high.
which is why it's so
Yeah.
high,
Yeah.
essentially.
And so all those things, you've actually got a lot of things up for discussion. And you're going to have an election in November where you're going to obviously get a few more elected members, and you might have a bit of a changeover. That would be the best time to be really looking at what capital is going to do to you and what you want your rates to do to help you achieve your strategic goals.
Depends on the self-interest of councils too.
Yeah, and look, the next council might come in with total different idea. At least then they will have 4 years where their strategies they set in that year will then go forward. If you do anything too dramatic this year, even if you go for a rate review, because you can do it within your annual business plan, but you'll be struggling at the moment where you're up to. If you do it significant now, you may just confuse everybody because we're going to have an election with new elected members potentially who might go down a different path. And it's going to be, and I'll show you in a little bit, it's going to be a significant change for people going from site to capital anyway. And that is probably the most opportune time. Changing rates is the thing that upsets ratepayers the most. So we need to be also mindful of that as we go through. You don't want ratepayers to go through more pain and confusion than they need to go through. So, capital versus site, we've discussed this. Minimum versus fixed, we've discussed that. General versus differential. General is just where everybody is rated the same rate in the dollar. They just set one general rate in the dollar. Land use versus locality. So we've discussed those issues. Right, now there's everyone who doesn't pay. So if someone doesn't pay rates, you still need the same total rates coming into your budget. That means everybody else is going to pay more. So we have mandatory and discretionary rebates within the legislation. These down here are mandatory. Hopefully, you don't have too many of those. You don't probably have a zoo.
Council.
Council is kind of, it doesn't raise rates on itself. State government, though, is. And then we have discretionary rebates as well. Now, there's another thing with recreation grounds. There's a Recreation Grounds Act, which says that if a recreation ground is open to the public, they're exempt from rates. So we not only have to worry about the Local Government Act, we've got these other things that throw out something every now and then. So typically your football club, if they are paying rates for themselves and the property is open to the public most of the week, I know they close it when you actually have a football club game, that would come under the Recreation Grounds Act and then be exempt from rates.
So is that based on whether it's a recreation reserve or
It's based on
what it's used for?
what it's used for. So it's based on being available to the public. So one council we had the Pistol Club.
We've got a couple of golf clubs that I know in.
Yeah, well, golf clubs are interesting.
We give
Can
them a rebate.
Okay, so if the public can walk around happily, fine. We had a Pistol Club that applied for this exemption, and we knew that it probably wasn't, but we sent it to the lawyers, and basically the public can just not walk around the Pistol Club whenever they want. You can see there might be some danger in that. So they decided it couldn't come under the recreation grounds exemption in that case.
Yeah, this is up under.
I think because most of our clubs lease land off the council for peppercorn rental,
Then they're not paying rates.
the ones that do
necessarily.
own it, the council has chosen to give them 100% rebate.
And councils will often do that
Yeah.
because it's an
Community
evening
benefit.
up of things where
Yeah.
council is looking after all those others, but that community is looking after that, so therefore we'll give them a rebate. And
That's been
that's fair.
policy.
Under the rebate section, the discretionary rebate section, you have a lot of flexibility for rebates.
Just a problem, councillor Means.
I couldn't tell you offhand, but if it's owned by them, then it'd be getting a rebate if it's on council. Rifle Club, for example, is on business lease.
So you have 2,565 properties, 180 are non-rateable, 2,385 therefore are rateable, 19 have discretionary rebates, 16 have mandatory rebates. Now, you have no postponements of rates. Julie's looking like I've got something wrong there. Okay, roughly that then. We'll fix up the slide before we send it to you. You have postponement of rates that you can offer for seniors. You can have rebates for fire, drought, flood, virus, anything else you think of. And you can waive fines and interest. But all of these things, if you're going to do them, need to be within your rating policy. So it's clear to everyone, because the one thing you must do is if one person is in one of these situations, everyone in that position must be offered the same rebate situation. So you can't say, I like Club A, so they can have a rebate, but I don't like Club B, so they can't have one. If they're the same, they can both apply for the rebate.
So just going back, for instance, if someone's doing a subdivision of block of land and you give them they'll have over 3 years to cut the blocks off, whatever, and just rate them as whole, then you've got to give that incentive to everyone.
So you have to treat everyone the same. So if you're a developer and you apply to subdivide your property, I can't rate you separately until you've got separate titles. Then Julie can rate you separately. Now, if it's all held by the developer, we can't put the fixed charge on each property. We can only do it once. But the moment, so you've got 10 in a row, the moment one of those is no longer in your ownership, that one I can put the fixed charge in, that one I can put the fixed charge in, but I can't put the rest of those until I've got another rate. That's applied to anyone in that situation.
You go to one person as incentive.
Now, there's another thing you can do though. You can do an incentive for an economic situation. So Coorong Council gave a 4-year rates holiday to the Ben Motorsport Park because council owned that property before and got no rates for it. The Ben Motorsport Park put millions of dollars into that property. 4 years must be coming close. The rates they're going to get from that will be dramatic. Adelaide City Council allowed anyone who built an apartment or bought an apartment off the plan not to have rates for a period of time. So you can do that sort of thing, but you would universally apply it, or it's something of such significant benefit, so Motorsport Park, that there isn't another example of it in the system. So you can, there's a lot you can do. Alexandrina Council, when Clipsal, as in the place that makes switches, not the racing cars, moved to their area, they did as an incentive a rates holiday for a period of time. But you would do it because it's going to make an incredible difference to the economic situation of your council. In that case, that factory moved there and they had employment, higher rates in the end, and so forth. So you've got a lot of flexibility. So 5.2, there we are. That is likely to change month by month at the moment. So if someone doesn't pay their rates, they're fined 2% for the quarter rates they didn't pay, and then they're fined 5.2% a year or 0.4333% each month until that payment is made. You need to have a debt collection policy, and you need to have some kind of policy that takes into account ratepayers facing financial difficulties. It's often a hardship policy. Ratepayers can make arrangements to pay over time. It's up to council what happens in that situation, but usually the interest and the fines still apply. Some councils in some situations during COVID waived the fines but not the interest. And of course, the postponement scheme.
What happens if we have a developer getting into monetary difficulties under the ratepayers policy?
So usually, most hardship policies I see are not for commercial entities. They're for individual ratepayers. So you have to define it very carefully. However, Mid-Murray is currently looking at a separate rate, just a little bit different. So they've got a marina on the side of the river. It's called Manor Waters. And the developer, that marina, under the Landscape Levy Act, council has to have a water licence to top up to cope with the evaporation that occurs within that. Legally, it has to. The original agreement between council and the developer was that council would eventually, once the development had started to progress, set a separate rate for that. So Mid-Murray is going through a rate review at the moment on that situation. So all those properties have a separate rate to cover the cost of that water allocation licence. It's quite significant too. So that's a situation where, but as part of that, because only half of it is developed, they didn't want to stall the development. So what they originally wanted to do was allow the developer to have 6 years before they got sold under a Section 184, and to continue paying interest but not fines. But the legal advice we got as we were exploring all these options was if we did it for the developer, we had to do it for everybody. So everyone in that development that's going to be charged a separate rate will have 6 years instead of 3 years before the Section 184 sale process kicks in. And they'll all be able to pay by instalments and have fines waived on that section and interest charge. So whatever was happening for one ratepayer had to happen for all the others.
So that ranks to 3 years to 6 years.
Yeah. So they're creating a separate rebate policy specifically for that. It's not rates, it's a separate rate specifically for a purpose. So I said before, rates are a tax. There's one exception, and that is a separate rate, where a separate rate is for a specific purpose. So Road at the moment, the marina, the foreshore, I think it's 12 properties on the foreshore want underground lighting. And so there'll be a separate rate. They will pay for it. So.
We have a separate rate for a contribution to the port of Nepal, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah. Okay, we've gone through this, single farm enterprises and adjoining properties, which means that you only get one fixed charge per ownership or occupy. Right, Section 184 we've mentioned, council can legally sell. The cool thing with this is that council is number one off the rank. They have a higher priority than the banks or the ATO. We get our money first in this situation. I would always recommend that if you're going down this path, that you go to an auction, not private treaty or sale, and because that sets a fair and reasonable amount, because you're not allowed to sell it just for the rates. You have to sell it for market value. And an auction is the only real way that you can set that market value. So hopefully you don't have to go down that path, but if you do, go to the lawyers, do it as open and honest and transparent as you can. Some councils will consider going to a 184 in confidence. I don't even recommend you do that. You don't have to name the ratepayer, you only have to name the property number. And oh my God, if you're doing that, those banks get the hang of that pretty quickly, and the next thing you know, you get a check from their mortgage bank.
Just go over that and just, because we've got an instance here at mine, exactly that. Now, you're saying that the actual the land has to be offered at the amount.
a market value. So-
Every point at the moment.
That's why I'm saying that you go to auction. It's the only fair, true way instead of market value.
So you can, your reserve would be whatever, well, you have reserve, but your reserve's gonna be whatever you
Reserve
put.
on for the rates.
That's what I mean, your reserve's
Yeah.
gonna be what you can get to read rates back.
These days, in these properties, other than if you've got exceptions in some of these places in the middle of their peninsula, you would not have a difficulty covering your rates. It'd be more so. The rest of the money, outside, once the rates are paid, council has to pass the rest of the money on to the owner of the property. Now, then, they might have obligations to pay ATO, mortgage, whatever, but that's not our problem.
So you're saying we shouldn't do that in confidence.
No, I'm saying, be honest, open, transparent. You might not put the person's name, but you can certainly put the assessment number.
We've done the reports in confidence, and the reason being is that in a town this size, it doesn't take long for people to work out exactly whose property it is. So that's.
And you'll be amazed at how quickly that gets paid.
Yeah, well, they've all been advised that that's what's happening. You know, through the, we've got the collection agencies, lawyers doing it for us, because it's too complex for us.
Because what you don't want to happen is to consider it in confidence and elected member then go and buy that property. Okay? That's what you don't want to happen, which is why I say put it in public, because that is a danger. I'm not saying anyone here will do that, but it can happen, it probably has, and you don't want that to happen. At the time the sale goes through, council gets their money, but that elected member then could probably argue for a much lower price on that property, and they've had privileged information. So that's why I say,
Unless it's an auction.
and that's why I say the whole thing, put the whole thing in public.
Say for instance, if you're taking someone to take an option for sale of land for rates, and the person has their land sold it to a councillor, does that matter?
It's what it looks like, which is why I say do the whole lot in public and do it as a public auction. Then it doesn't matter who buys it. If a councillor buys it at a public auction, everyone
Yeah,
will.
whatever.
Now, there's a lot of things you can do before you get to this point. So if you've got a senior, explore the postponement options. They probably didn't know about it or didn't look at it. If you've got someone in a hardship position, they might not have asked. So you would go down every other option first, including payments by, making a payment plan for them, all of that, because this is terrible publicity for council if a little old widowed lady is chucked out of her home because she couldn't pay her rates. So you go through every avenue you can. Now we have a lot less sympathy if it's something like Marina was, where it was a commercial entity from overseas. But to be honest, most Section 184 sales are often deceased estates where no one can find who owns it, landlocked bits of land that no one really owned. Most Section 184s tend to be that kind of property. So the ones you've seen are probably more like that.
We've got a few. We've had a few, but they've paid before auction about 3 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, believe
we
me,
had
the
to-
banks tend to get in
Yeah.
pretty quick.
Went 7 or 8, I reckon.
Now, there was a little scheme that happened a long time ago. Do you remember when, this would have been the 80s, do you remember when farms took out a whole lot of overseas loans, then interest rates went crazy, and these farms were getting foreclosed? Now, I think it was in the Eyre Peninsula or the York Peninsula.
Tommy Boat.
I don't know exactly who, and it was a long time ago. There was a CEO that twigged to the fact that they could do this process. If the bank didn't know, Fred could sell to Jack for the cost of the rates and sell it back to Fred for the cost of the rates. And they got out of their mortgages. Their mortgages were wiped. Now, the banks then got the hang of this And the banks now have someone go through every government gazette, section 184 notice, everywhere, in South Australia, because it runs differently in other states. So, there you go.
Well, that kind of happened here. I'm not a farmer,
A little bit of history there.
but that kind of happened here, but, it was common knowledge that people, farmers were getting sold up. Don't you know it's going to all my land?
Maybe this is where the story came from. I can't even tell you the validity of this story, but there you go. So we discussed a little bit of this. Your rates are a tool, like a whole lot of other tools you've got. But they can be a powerful tool in order to look at what you want for your community, and can you use your rates to achieve that? Or are your rates doing the opposite, actually damaging what you're trying to achieve? So we discussed higher rates in the dollars or lower rates in the dollars to attract certain situations. Having a higher rate in the dollar for the silos is very common because lots of councils feel that they have a big impact on council roads. But on the other side of the coin, how big an employer are they in your district too? So do we really want to sink them? So these are some of the things you need to think about. Capping, discounts, you bring that in, and you will probably need to bring that in over the next couple of years when we start looking at the effect from going from site to capital to ease the burden over a little bit longer period, because we're going to see that for some people this is going to be a dramatic change. And you might have rebates, as we've said, to encourage certain activities or to have short-term challenges helped. So to encourage certain activities, there's that rebate section of the Act allows you to have a situation where a rates holiday is provided. Or you might do that every new property, every new business that opens up in an unused shop will get a rates holiday for a year. You might do something like that. That can be quite useful, particularly if you're trying to attract from another town in another council area, or just to help that activity happen. And as I said, there's things we can't do. So the Murray councils are inundated with intensive farming feedlots. They're wrecking their roads. They can't charge them anything different than the broadacre farms. Mining, wind farms, solar farms, which are commercial activities, but we can't charge them any differently really to a shop other section. So
Would a port fit in the same scenario?
a port, yeah, you could probably only really put it as, well, I can't remember what your VG would like, you put it in there, probably put it as commercial and industry, but you can't do anything else with it.
Other than it'll have a higher capital value than
Yeah, other than it'll have a higher capital value. Airbnbs, they're residential. There's nothing in the rating system, and this comes up at every coastal town I go to, where they go, why can't we charge the Airbnbs more? We can't. There's nothing in the rating legislation that allows us to charge them differently.
Why aren't they commercial?
The land use is residential. You would have to get the VG to make a separate ruling that they're commercial, but half the time council doesn't even know who they are.
How about, we've got a town centre with a lot of businesses, you know, and like a lot of towns were probably busier in the 80s and 90s, and now those businesses have become residences. Is there any measure to pursue that, or once a land type is set?
Oh, no, land types are flexible. Land use is flexible to whatever the predominant use is. So a shop can become a resident can become a shop, as long as your planning laws allow that to happen.
But we have a lower rate for commercial than we do for residential.
Yeah,
So right now,
so
those residing are getting a lower.
if they're a residential property and the VG has determined they're residential, predominantly residential, so that becomes a bit complicated where you've got a house and a shop in the same property, then they'll be classed as residential. Oh, and another thing we can't do, I really can't see why state government departments should be non-rateable. How is that fair?
That sounds good.
But we can't stop them being non-rateable at this point. All right, so you also have some other charges that you can do. So you have SWIMS, so you're aware of how that service charge works. I don't think you've got waste.
Yes, we do.
You have got waste collection. So
The townships only.
the townships only. So there's a separate charge there. With these service charges, both SWIMS and waste, there's a lot of discussion in a lot of councils about house versus vacant block. The situation is that the legislation states if the property can access the service, it goes past, they can be charged. Now, that doesn't sit well with every council, so we do have a whole gamut of different approaches to this. So we'll have SWIMS with some councils where it's exactly the same rate whether you're occupied or unoccupied, and others that will have a different rate. With SWIMS, the argument, so at Coorong Council, they had vacant and occupied, and they decided to have one rate. The reason being, the particular area that had that SWIMS charge was on the River Murray. They were all non-resident ratepayers, holiday homes, very wealthy homes. The community of Taylor Bend and the surrounding towns have a very low socioeconomic level. And they had SWIMS as well. If we didn't charge the same rate for everyone, these guys were getting a benefit to the detriment of all those people that were living there who had a much lower socioeconomic status than these guys. So you need to think about these things in your particular situation, which is likely to be very different to Coorong's or anyone else's. Waste collection, of course, you only do within the township, but if you went to rural, in the regulations, it restricts when you've got bin banks, so many metres from the collection point, you start getting discounts, so that becomes complicated. And some places, remember, I think you've got water? No, some places have water. Where there's water, I always get a little nervous because if council provide water, they need to make a decision, is it non-potable, potable, can they drink it without dying? What's your risks involved? What kind of treatment do you have to do? So if you haven't yet got it, don't go down that path.
That was supply water to sport organisations, golf courses. Or technically, we supply to our own reserves and just our own. Well, Rovers as the.
So it's SA water, is it?
Clubs as.
No, that comes, our water, the water comes from the SWIMS.
Okay.
But
So in
water
that case,
houses
you're not
is-
supplying it to houses.
No.
So where we had an issue at Yangalilla Council was Rabbit Bay had 6 houses. And traditionally, they had all had water from the creek supplied to their houses to an outside tap. The creek upriver was a ratepayer who hated council and deliberately put all these cows at the point where the creek went from, which meant the water was pretty bad. Over years, these guys in the 6 houses had extended their plumbing for their council supplied water and brought it inside. And they were renting them out as property as holiday homes. And there was nothing to indicate that this was non-potable water. Once council realised what was going on, because this was a drought, so the 6 houses came to council and said, can we get more water because we're running out, the creek's running dry. Council hadn't realised what was going on. Once they realised that, they went, cut off the water. They gave everyone a rainwater tank. They supplied them 1 year's worth of tank water, and left them after that because they couldn't accept the risk. It was ridiculous what was going on. So, just be careful with that. It's a totally different situation where council's providing treated SWIMS water, which is probably watered down, to recreation grounds. Usually there'll be a sign there saying that this is mixed water. Totally different than plumbing it to houses. Having said that, there are a lot of situations now where reuse water can be used, but it's got a special coloured pipe and it's pipes separately, and there's a whole lot of controls around that. Right, now site to capital. These values are what they are now. They will change again by next year and the year after. But this is just to give you an idea of what will happen with your properties once you move from site to capital. So this is the first section, which is the township properties, excluding commercial, industry and other. So basically it's the residential properties within your township. Remember, we only raise the same amount of dollars that we plan to in our long-term plan. So when we do a rate review, we mix it up and we change which part of the pie everybody pays for, but we're still getting this bucket of rates. So by going from site to capital with those massive increases in values, the effect is your rate in the dollar goes down because you're still getting the same bucket of rates.
These accounts are based on still having a fixed charge, so only.
This is still using, like I haven't gone to all the different scenarios we can go to. This is very simply using the same fixed charge of $712 and then doing the valuation times the rate in the dollar. And the rate in the dollar has been calculated lower to reach the same total rates.
In reality, are you better off sometimes getting the fixed charge altogether? Getting rid of the fixed charge altogether. Having a minimum rate.
You can have a minimum, but they're the kind of things you need to explore in a rate review. What are the effects of all these different scenarios on these properties? So I've only got two scenarios here. I've left the fixed charge as it is. I've used the current differential between the different, like the comparison of the rate in the dollar to the residential. And the other comparison I've done is if all the rates in the dollar were exactly the same. So we've only got two scenarios here. When you start going down a rate review path, you've got fixed versus minimum. Do we stay with our locality land use? Do we go straight to land use? And then how we mix all this up as well. What capping we might not want to bring in. So in this situation, will we say that no one will pay more than 10% increase in rates from their previous year? If we're going to do that, that creates a whole different scenario. So there's a whole lot of things.
That rules the bottom to that.
Okay?
That rules the bottom to that.
So this gives you an idea. This was the site value of these properties. This is the average site value that paid this much. When we move to capital value, now you'll notice that goes down because the rate in the dollar's gone down, so is that. But then we get up here and we've got significant increases here.
When you're talking capping, just kind of jump around what's in there. How long can you keep capping on there for?
Okay, so there's some capping that can only go for 1 year, some for 3, some for 10. So you've got to work out, there's also capping that you might
There's only three, 1, 3 or 10.
1, 3 or 10, depending on what you're doing the capping on. There's also, you've got to look at, am I capping against the amount paid the previous year or the amount raised the previous year? Year 1, that doesn't matter. Year 2, it does, because I'm either comparing it to the extra of after they've got the capping or before they've got the capping. Now, one way costs council a lot more dollars, and then they get the hiccup further on, but it's a bit kinder. The other way only delays the inevitable a little bit, but it's cheaper for council. So that's another scenario you're going to have to look at, is if you want to bring capping in, which you may need to do, then how are you going to work that? For what period are you going to do it for? And what does a sample property look like? They're going to be impacted year 1, 2, and 3.
You see, a lot of that will depend on what you do with your fixed charge.
Absolutely.
Because that affects obviously township properties a lot more at present than it does rural properties.
So rule of thumb, fixed charge, the higher the fixed charge, the better off the wealthier properties are. Minimum tends to be a bit kinder to lower value properties. But it's much of a muchness depending on the levels of those two. So the things you need to explore, and I'm suggesting you do it over the next 12 months, after your election is have to go from site to capital, haven't got a choice. Do we want to stay at our mix of locality and land use, or do we want to move to land use only? Do we want to have a differential? If so, what is reasonable for that differential and why? Do we want all the rates in the dollar the same? That is the most equitable way when you think of as a wealth tax. The higher the value, probably the higher the paid rates. But there's a but coming that I'll show you in a little bit. If we're going to have capping to ease the burden, how are we going to do that? I also haven't seen the transition system being brought in by the local government reform yet. I don't know that anyone has yet. They've talked about it, but we don't know what that is yet.
We just picked those examples there. I'd say 450,000 per average, but you've got properties here, 1.2 million,
Absolutely.
600,000,
This is only an
900,000.
average.
I know, so that's where the real problem comes
Yeah.
in.
So when you do the rates review, you'll have a lot more than these samples. You'll have a whole range of samples that you're tracking to see, person in this situation, what happens to them. So you tend to look in each different situation, you look at low value, medium value, high value, and what is happening to those properties.
Because I'm going from, because we were talking about doing this 7, 8 years ago, and I've done a sample of about 100 properties in the towns, are going to get definitely penalised compared to a rural area. That's the problem, the rural area seems to get let off pretty good under a capital rating compared to a township.
They do if you keep everything the same as this, then they do, because they're not as affected. The majority of their property value is land anyway. But if you move to a rate in the dollar that's much more similar, you can, and we'll see that when we get to them, you can diminish that, advantage to a lot. Yeah, you're removing that advantage.
Yeah, so what happens here is,
I'll go to, this is this one. Okay, these are farms.
well, that's probably more for
Right.
WA now, but
Now, if we look, this is using the same residential, the same differential. And the farms all are much better off. This is using where rate in the dollar is the same for all the properties.
those examples there are very out of date. You wouldn't buy a farm 1,000 acres in
That's
Sunday
coming
Bay.
from your property.
I know,
Rates, property data.
but you really wouldn't buy.
We've got some high ones later.
Yeah, we have got some
right,
high ones as
right,
well. This is just, I've taken the average site to see what happens to it in examples where it moves to capital. So this is only the average site.
I'll probably get 100.
That's what your average is. But you certainly do have properties with much higher than that that are going to be impacted a lot more.
This year, probably be rural areas.
Do you think that we should be trying to reconcile the two as here, like deciding what a typical property should pay 100,000 site versus say 400 capital, and then be working backwards from there? Or do you think we should start from scratch?
I'd start from scratch. Your system is more complicated than it needs to be at the moment, and not necessarily addressing your needs as a council. So I would start from scratch. You have the perfect opportunity because you can go in this government. So you didn't decide to go from site to capital. Someone else is forcing you to. You're having to cope with it. This is the perfect time to relook at your whole rating methodology and go, okay, we have to do this. And capital is more equitable. The wealthier properties pay more. What else do we need to do to make this work for everyone? Now, all the rates in the dollar the same is definitely the most equitable. If I have $1 million property, I'm paying more than $100,000 property. That's fine. It doesn't matter what I'm using the land for. If you start from this basis, so if you start your discussions at all the rates in the dollar the same, then go, okay, if everyone is doing a fair share, what situation is my council in that means I might want to vary this a bit? So, do I want to address something in the commercial other office shop? Do I want to address something in industry? Do I want to address vacant land? Do I want to address something in farming? And then you go from there and make any variations. Your commercial properties, they drop, no matter which scenario we look at. But again, that's just that average one. This is the one that you're probably not going to feel real comfortable about. Even if all the rate in the dollar is the same, they drop. So if you were starting from the premise of all rates in the dollar are the same, now what do we want to do? This is one where you might want to have that as a higher rate
That's
of dollar.
only bulk handling.
That's only bulk handling, because that's why you brought this in the first place. If you leave the differential as it is, you're getting some extreme variations in
So
rates.
the history of the bulk.
And I think
bulk
Viterra
handling-
is going to have an absolute freak out of this.
The history of the bulk handling was originally they were rated based on a formula that was on the volume of grain. And when that got scrapped,
Okay?
council reached the volume of storage
Yeah.
capacity. Council reached an agreement with whoever it was at the time.
Yep.
To put in place a rate that collected a similar amount under.
That's how you came to it.
That's
Okay.
how we got the number.
So the reason why some councils have brought this in more recently is the amount of traffic on the roads and trucks. But the other side of that coin is, if this is a significant employer in your district, you need to take that into account too. In which case, are you really going to have this scenario here? You're probably not. I mean, they're used to paying 49,000. In this scenario, they're paying 344. That's an increase that no one can cope with. So I'd be moving to the rate and the dollar, they being the same, and then go, however, in this case, for these reasons, we think this particular area, and even if you've got land use, there's quite a few councils that have got land use for everything else, but still have bulk handling zone. So they have bulk handling zone commercial land use.
So that one there would be something like silos and go about 7 million, 700.
Yeah.
Have you right? What? That 7 million would be Tumbly Bay, wouldn't it?
I presume so. If there's four there, there's.
So this is the case where you might go, yes, we want to retain the bulk handling, commercial bulk handling. So we're using by land use for everyone else, but we're doing land use and locality for this lot. And we're not going to do the rate and the dollar the same. We're going to vary it so that they are paying a higher portion for these reasons. So everything you do in a rate review needs to have a reason, because you're going to go into the community and you're going to have to stand up and explain that reason to them, and it's got to make sense. Because everyone that gets a less they pay, someone else is paying more, and I can tell you it's usually the residential properties in the townships that get that.
So out of those four there, 2 of those are the only ones that have been used. Is that right? Tumbly Bay and Port Mill.
I think one of them's got 2 properties. I'm not sure which one. Angara doesn't get used. That's
And Warmen, that's not an area, is it?
I don't think so.
Warmen, the side, is that an area? No.
I don't know.
Just wonders because the only ones between Tumbly Bay, Port Mill, Angara, it must be Warmen. Oh, I suppose it could be another offshoot of Angara or somewhere. But where Angara's not being used now.
Wow, then that's a hard thing to say to the owners of
See, but they shut
probably
the
Volterra.
silo down.
That's a hard thing to say to them. Well, you're going to pay this much in rates or something.
It would be only one of those low ones, which they'd probably get.
Oh, so that's not,
Yeah,
well,
they'd get discount anyway.
74,000 is still, and that's where you need to take that into account. Siri sometimes talks back to me. I was doing one of these things and Siri goes, I don't understand. There it is again. So anyway, we'll ignore Siri. This is where you have to really look at it.
Hello, Sarah, you got the crossword numbers for this week, please?
You recognise my voice. This is where you have to look at the reasons. If you have a higher rate of dollar for these properties, why? If the reason is because of the amount of truck use on the roads, then if they're not even using that property, that reason doesn't apply. but how are you going to make everybody the same in this situation? So that's where you need to have a deep dive about why you're doing a particular methodology and is it fair?
And that's a valid type argument for the regional waste facility. It employs locals who live locally predominantly, but we also get the shortest distance for them to cart out rubbish to, because the contractor owns the dump and owns the trucks. So we're paying less than all the other councils are, because they've got to bring it all the way over here. So you know, there's swings around now.
So there are lots of
Okay,
councils that
proper.
want to hit those places, but then they need to also think about those other sides of things as well.
And trouble is there, when that regional dump first started, it was 28 tons. Now we've got Wyler coming down here. I think Cow and Cleve are very close. I don't know what I'm doing here, but Wyler's coming down here. Why should they pay more? That's my argument.
Well, and it's a valid argument
Take
if
the
it's
rubbish back to
impacting on your costs, in which case your cost for dumping should cover your, the charges for dumping should cover your costs now and future costs. The only other impact then you're looking at is any impact on the road system. So you just want to make sure that whatever you set, you have a real good reason for doing it.
There's also another hidden impact that we've got to go to tender, and they've pretty much got a monopoly, so if we slug them, they can turn around and slug us.
Then all the councils in that scenario get charged, don't they?
No, because we can go to tender with the other
So anyway, that's one little complication on its own. So, and we've picked out 3 particular properties here and what will happen to them. And of course, these values will change by the time you're actually doing this. But this is what will happen to these properties. You can see this farming is just, this is why I'd be advocating this, because of the effect on the farmers, and it just evens everybody up a bit more. But you can see under your current differential with your current fixed charge, you're getting some significant impacts, which might not seem a great deal because we're looking at a property that's worth a bit, but that's a lot for somebody to have to increase their rates without, like all of a sudden. And this is where you might look, once you look at your methodology, but you also might look at capping to ease the burden over time.
Well, that's the only way you can do it.
I think it's the only way you're going to be able to do it, and I don't know whether you're going to be forced to do it with the legislation reform, which we don't know about yet. They might actually say you need to do the capping, but I think you need to.
Couldn't expect people to pay 100% rate.
No. It's a lot of money, which is why you're going to do this in an election year.
Don't worry.
After the election. Well, you're forced to anyway. So, rate reviews, section under the Act. You have to do it if you're going to change the basis on which land is valued. Well, in your case, it's changing from site to value without any choice. So, I've yet to see whether the legislation is going to force you to do a rate review. I think you need to do one anyway, just to make it very clear what's going on. If you're declaring a separate rate or a service charge, you need to do a rate review. It is not really clear as to what impact or what change actually pips a rate review. If I change my rate dollar by this much, or I change the percentage by this much, it's not really clear when you have to bring it in. But I'm saying that if there is a community section, wherever you decrease something, somebody else is impacted more. If there's going to be any section of your community that is going to be worse off, you need to do a rate review. You need to make it as open, transparent as you
Just go
can.
back to the previous slide. See where you mentioned that business there.
That one?
Yeah, if you went down a rate review, can you mention that business when you're doing a rate review?
Oh, you wouldn't in the rate review paper. You might when you're looking at the modelling within council to go, okay, so-and-so, what
Should-
kind of business is being affected by this?
Shouldn't that modelling be available to everyone? Though? That's the main thing. You can't really hide that, can you, or not?
Oh, so what we've done in the past is when it comes to consultations, so what we did at Mid-Murray Council was at a massive rate review. They went from an absolute crazy complicated locality system to land use. And so what we did there is we set up a spreadsheet on the website which could enable them to put their valuation and it would calculate what the effect would be. So we could be, and we did pages of examples. So we tried to cover every different possibility so people could see it. And we had live setups so that people could go, my rate say I'm valued at this, what would happen in that case for me? So it's the more transparent that you can be, the better you are. Even though it's going to be pain for some people.
I'm just worried. I'd have no problems taking it to the public, but the business there might not want their name.
No, and you'd probably put large commercial property
Yeah, well,
Yeah. in that information.
Marina drilling, that covers the whole
Yeah.
marina.
Yeah.
Hydro pump, and that one, yeah. And
So that's inclusive of fixed charges too, isn't it?
Yes. And see, that's another thing you're really got to think about is what you're going to do about this fixed charge. Is it going to be at the same level? Is it going to be a different level? What changes in all this if we change that? What changes in all this if we bring a minimum charges?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of complicated modelling that has to happen, a lot of scenarios you're going to go through. You'll be so sick of them until you find a system you go, you know, this one looks.
So as a general rule, would you advocate that the council gets to that final position before they start consultation?
I would say that you minimise the options before you go to consultation, because otherwise your feedback is going to be chaotic. It's going to be really hard to work out what's going on. So I think what you do before you go to consultation is you think carefully about the principles and you think carefully about what you're trying to aim for, what looks like it's fair, what has an impact that is palatable, how you're going to roll this out. There's nothing wrong with rolling it out over a few years, even without capping. What you can do is slightly change things from year after year until you get there. But the fact that you've got a site to capital, that's a big whammy. Capping's probably the only tool you've got to help that. So you have basically your principles are agreed on, and then you go out to consultation. But the reason why you need to allow yourself some time in consultation is you might get back arguments that are really good, but you haven't thought about. And that may go, you may then go, well, you know what, that's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that. Or that's actually really unfair. I hadn't thought of the effect on those people. And you need to make sure you take that on board. Even if you go out to consultation a second time, it is better to do this fairly thoroughly in the consultation. Under the legislation, you can have 3 weeks, and you can have 1 hour within the public meeting at the end of the 3 weeks. That's all you have to do. But the councils I've seen that do this well and where the community is happiest, not everyone's going to be happy, but where they have the most success is those who have done a number of different community sessions, depending on where your community is. I've even had councils where they've got a lot of ratepayers that live in the city do one session in the city. So more than one session, a workshop type thing, a little bit of a presentation, a workshop, a discussion, an opportunity for people to go, what's going to happen to me? And then come back to council and go, this is where we got to, this is all the information back. From this, we recommend that you consider these differences than we had originally. Even if that then goes back out and goes, hey, this is what we're going to do. You don't have to do that second consultation because you end up doing it in your annual business plan anyway. It has that second right to it.
If you think of thinking around that now, is there anything wrong, say, you get rid of your fixed charge and just go to minimum right now?
Again, you'd need a rate review now. You haven't got time.
Yes, you need to wait for you just for
Yeah,
that.
to go from fixed charge to minimum because it would have an impact. So you haven't got time for that.
But they go on fixed charge.
Lower the fixed charge, remember, that sounds good, lower the fixed charge, but that means the rate in the dollar goes up and somebody else is getting somewhere. So if you're going to impact on someone, you really should do a rate. In fact, at the moment,
So even
I'd
if that's
always,
the case, just the rate of the dollar could affect someone, so you can cover their own
Yes.
straight away, so.
this year I wouldn't be changing things too much. The rate of the dollar moves because the total bucket is X and the following year it's Y, so the rate of the dollar changes accordingly. If values go up, the rate of the dollar drops.
So
But
it's fixed charge. Fixed charge has been going up, as it going on.
often councils will put the fixed charge up by inflation, which is pretty
Well, roughly, that's
acceptable.
what we're thinking.
This year I wouldn't be doing a lot because you're going to do a lot next year.
I was just trying-
Unless you've got a real urgent reason to change something now, I wouldn't be.
So how do you educate the community of what's coming?
Yeah, well, this is, I think it's going to be very important that you have a lot of community sessions about why you're moving from site to
So
site.
you've said tonight,
Mhm.
start with after the next council election.
Yeah.
That's what you said.
And I'd start with, so you're going to have potentially quite a number of new councillors. I'd start with some really good workshops with them so they all understand this, and then start exploring about your principles. What strategies do you want to follow? What do you think is fair? Then do modelling accordingly, which might be a variety of things. What do you see problems with in the current system? What are you concerned about? Do modelling according to that. Get a consensus, which will take a little bit. Then go out to the community with workshops about why it's happening, what's happening, what your principles are and why, and the options. And you have more than one option, just don't put too many in. The options you're looking at and the impact of those options. So you might go out to them and go, this is the impact if we use fixed, this is the impact if we use minimum. You could do that. Don't go without too many options, or otherwise the feedback's just going to be totally confused. Because in the end, the ratepayer's worried about this final figure, whichever figure it is. That's what they're worried about. What's the impact on me? And is it fair?
So my observation is that come first budget after the new council's formed, they're not going to have the time to do it either.
No, because I would start in January. You'll have time if you start in
For the first
December or
budget.
January.
For the first budget of the new council.
We normally start on the first budget around about March, April.
So you change.
You'd start
then.
before the new budget.
That's right. So you wouldn't be starting later this year because you said then it's like.
You'd
the
start,
council election.
because you've got a new council, you'd start in December with the conversations to council about what this is,
That's
what it
what you do,
means,
Rich.
what are your options. Then you'd go January, February, you'd explore those and get out to consultation as early as you can.
Yeah.
You can do consultations separate to your annual business plan
Oh,
and much earlier than your annual business plan.
I think, like personally, I think we probably, when the new council's elected, we need to give them a quick upskilling on the asset plans and the long-term financial plan, because ultimately that affects the reasons they're rating. And then you do your rate review, and then you roll from that into your budget and your business plan process once you've got that rate review. They may have to overlap slightly, but it'd be good to have that bedded down before you get too deep into your.
I mean, your rate
So-
review, you've got to do training on what rates are and how they work anyway. So you
So your
incorporate
first
that.
budget can be a capital value based budget.
Yeah,
Or-
I know you don't have to
I won't
for
have the knowledge to do
2023.
this, though. It's taken me 3 years to get my head around it as a first time. They wouldn't be able to do that in the first 6 months.
What for?
Um,
No way.
But they'll have intensive
Yeah, just
one-on-one
on
with the
that.
consultant
Yeah.
working through it, like, so it'll be a process that we'll be learning as well. Because we haven't done a major rate review and said, result in any major
No.
change.
The rate reviews that I've done, I'd have to say the most valuable part of it has been the elected members learning. And I've had rate reviews, you're not going to be able to because you're going from site to capital, but I've had rate reviews where we've done all the workshops with council. And they got to the point where they understood everything and they said, you know what, our system isn't so bad. I don't think we need to change it. Okay. You're not going to have that luxury because it's changing despite you. But that has been a situation with some council. We've gone, fine. There we go. You've got out what you needed to.
So from elected members' perspective, is that we've got to go into a community seat re-election.
Yep.
Not fully understanding the capital value raised.
Well, in a way you don't have to because you're not making the choice to go capital value. State government's doing it for you. All you'll be doing next year is going, okay, this is inevitable. It's coming in 2023. By the time we get to the election, we'll have a better understanding from local government reform as to what law they're going to put around this. And I think you'll be in a better position to go, it's coming, let's ease it in, and let's just start easing it in.
People putting their hand up to be a councillor, really, they've got to get their head around this, whether they're prepared to do that. That's what worries me. That,
well, people put their hand up for being a councillor and they don't know anything about planning, rates, finance, every other asset management.
when
It would be great if your candidates had to go through that training first, but at the moment, that doesn't exist as a you have a candidate's information session. That's about all you get. Even the 7 hours that you're legislated to have to do as training on everything is not enough. I mean, there's 2 hours on finance, and in finance, because I've done them, in finance I've got to cover all finance, budgets, budget reviews, rates, and I've just said to council, look, tell you what, spread it out, do more hours, you can't get the whole thing done.
See, just for something like this going from site value to capital value, the new council should be fully aware of the consequences that can happen. And they won't be trained, they won't know about it.
If they decide, if they start this process in December and they go, hey, and we'll have a better idea of what law is around this section by then, if they go, hey, we're not going to do it till we have to, okay. So at least they'll know the process they need to go through.
They'll be part of all the modelling, so they'll have it illustrated to them what the consequences are. Like at the moment, we don't know the consequences, but when it gets to that situation, that'll be the modelling, that'll illustrate the consequences.
I mean, the legislation for local government changes all the time. When you guys came on, legislation reform, the SCOSA rates oversight didn't exist. It wasn't even, they did discuss some potential rates capping of some kind, but basically it wasn't anything like you're currently looking at. So when you come onto council, we don't know. Those of us who've been working in it forever don't know what's going to happen next.
But something like this should be given to any prospective new councillor, one put their hand up, before I come on board to know what the consequences could be.
But it's not like we're hiding it from the public either.
No, I realise that.
It's been in the news, it's in the papers, and I feel like those people who are wanting to nominate have got their ears to the ground on what's happening within.
You can certainly do a candidate session where you go through anything. You've got a minimum amount you have to cover in a candidate session. You can do as much as you like in a candidate session.
How do you go with like a conflict then? If a councillor has $5 million worth of property, for example, when it's about to go from $400,000 to $5 million, how do you deal with that?
With the conflict. This is really interesting because you've got elected members that are all farmers
Only 6 of us too.
and they make the rate and the dollar lower for farmers. Is that a conflict? Looks like one. Taniara's just done it. Isn't, because in the legislation, where you're making a decision that's universal, not counted as a conflict.
That happened 7 years ago, exactly that.
But and look, we'll be honest that councils that have predominantly farmers have lower rates of the dollar for farmers. Councils that are predominantly businesses might have a different perspective. They actually don't have a lower rate of the dollar. Sometimes they have a separate rate just for businesses to promote business. With the Harbour has that, Unley has that, Norwood has that. So,
I still believe it. A lot of people coming as council things probably going to be walking parts. What do you do? This should be actually in their training. They want to be a councillor, exactly, especially if the council's come so not all councils.
there has been discussion about the amount of training a candidate should have. Nothing is being determined. I think the state government's very cautious and they don't want to put people off becoming a elected member. They'd rather leave the shop do you actually want. But
Hello, who bought the legislation?
so anyway, this is your timeline and why I'm saying you cannot do it this year. Is it working back from your adoption date and the information that I've seen within your
week later.
timetable anyway? Basically, you already passed the agenda with the annual business plan that's going out for consultation. You cannot do a rates review now. You just can't.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to do a rate review.
So,
I know that, I just,
yeah. So at the moment, playing with the peripheral, doing lots of modelling is just using up a lot of time and a lot of energy and not actually giving you anything. I think you wait until you can actually do this properly.
Bring the budget out later, you know,
It can. The problem with that is that the later your adoption for the council budget, the later any of your projects can start, because they don't have authority to start any projects until that budget is adopted.
And
So, and the new legislation only lets you go to the 15th of August, not the 31st. And
it's another month.
yeah, it's another month, but that's also 1 month less or 1.5 months less for your staff to actually get all those projects in the annual business plan done. So there's lots of councils that will adopt their budget towards the end of June, so they're ready to go 1st of July.
Some of those projects later next year will get done in 1 year.
No, but you want as little as possible to carry over. You want to be able to get, you've promised your community a whole raft of things within the annual business plan. You want to be able to deliver them. So a lot of councils actually do look at adopting their budget in late June, and they're ready to go 1st of July, bang, here's our budget, off we go. The other problem with leaving it too late, and even if it's the 15th of August, is that you've got to have a month for people to receive their rate notices before they pay them. Now, if you want your first rate notice, you have to have your first rates paid in September. You have to go to the minister if you want to vary that. So it's starting to get pretty fine because rates have to be run, they have to be printed, and they have to be sent out. And so a 6-week turnaround is pretty difficult. It's really pushing it.
especially when we've only got one staff member that does
Yeah,
that
you just get
along
one with
everything else.
COVID and you've lost it. So, I wouldn't be going any later than that with your budget. Especially as I don't think you're going to gain enough out of doing a rates review now compared to the power of doing it with the new council. The other thing I just want to mention, and this will come up when you do a rates review, part of the rates review that comes up is a lot of people discussing yourself compared to others. And I just want to go through data and where it comes from. So the Council in Focus, you'd be aware of that website. There's a few problems with that data, and when you're coming to do a rates review, you need to understand that data is not perfect. So when we're looking at data, when you start to do rate review, you need to understand what data does. So at the moment, the data on that Council in Focus website is 1920 data from the 1920 financial statements. We are now 2nd of May 2022. The 2021 stuff is actually not July. I've checked with the Grants Commission. It's July/August. By the time that information's coming out,
Well, that's something June.
it's late. Yeah, I spoke to Grants Commission yesterday, and they said, and they said July, August at this point, but it's always later than that because we're always waiting for some odd councils to get that information finalised. When you look at the council in focus, you'll see that there's a section there where they compare you to like-minded councils. They don't define what that is, but the only thing I can work out is that it's worked out on the Australian Local Government Code. In your case, your rural agricultural medium doesn't take into account whether you're on the coast or not on the coast. Doesn't take into account the kind of industries that you've got, doesn't take into account whether you've got drought, fire, flood as your challenges. There'll be other councils in that don't charge a waste fee. So their rates are higher because they don't charge a rates fee. You charge a waste fee, and so your rates are a little bit lower because you've already collected your fee somewhere else. It doesn't show you that. You've got jetties. There are rural agricultural councils that have no water. So they don't have jetties. And jetties cost a lot. So some have, and jetties aren't your only coastal issue. So there are councils on the coast that are starting to understand some of their coastal assets are going to be an absolute bane in the future and incredibly expensive. So councils that don't have that issue.
But you can select on that side,
You can,
the focus of the council that you want something.
yeah, you can look at different councils.
So you could do it. So it's not
Yeah, you can look at different councils. I've been doing this a long time. I've yet to find two identical councils.
No, I'm not looking for identical councils, but your nearby councils, which want to rate.
Yeah,
They're going to compete.
But they've still got different impacts. I mean, your neighbouring councils have different impacts than you. You've got holiday housing. Someone inland doesn't have that.
Clear councils, good example.
Yeah.
Coastal as well as.
The biggest issue we've got is that we've got very high value rural land, and that, so it's deemed our capacity to pay is higher. We get a lot less local government grants commission funding than most of these other like-sized councils. And the average person doesn't pick up on that when they look at statistics.
And I've been at a meeting at Kingston Council where the Grants Commission dialed in and said, your values of your rural ratepayers are high, you should be charging them more.
I bet you said the same.
But the state government at the same time has got a SCOSA saying,
Yeah.
no, you can't charge everybody more. So, yeah. So
That's what I'm going to say.
you can certainly compare within councils, but it's much better to look at trends over time, and particularly in your own council, to look at trends over time. Because you might have, like Rove's got an undergrounding or power situation. Their financial statements are really weird for 1 year. It doesn't take that into account. It doesn't take into account that you've got a particular issue that somebody else hasn't, or you're dealing with something that somebody else isn't. So it's just to keep in mind that the information can be useful, and then when you do a rates review, we look at all that sort of stuff. But you just got to keep in the back of your mind, there's no perfect comparison. And in the end, I had a council that did a rates review that said, you know what, we don't care about what everyone else is doing. We want to make this work for our community. We only want to worry about the impacts on our community. So we looked at socio-economic status. We looked at the industries and businesses within their council, and they worked out what they wanted to do. And they didn't worry about what Fred was doing down the road. And that's a pretty sensible way of doing that. So, okay. Are there any other questions that we haven't already covered as we go on?
The one that probably bugs me is for recovery of rates, where we've been in committee on it. Should we regress and bring it out in the public or not?
Are you saying for your budgeting?
No, to be accountable to the public, or whatever what you're saying before, but because we've done it in committee.
Oh, okay. So it depends what your council has got as a policy for your committee and your workshops and so forth. And some councils discuss everything in the public, other councils don't. In the end, what you're coming up with has to be in the public. Your end business plan has to be in the public, and it has to have a public meeting, and it has to go for community consultation. it's up to your council to work out what works best for you guys. When you're looking after model after model after model of different financial statements, different types of things like that, that can be unwieldy to make it public, but you can certainly do so. It's totally up to the council. At this point, we're not looking at making anything differently dramatically in rates. You're looking at your overall rates to cover the costs of your long-term plan. And that becomes public the moment you put out your annual business plan.
I think Councillor Lawrence referred to considered in confidence a report outlining which properties are overdue on rates, and we are starting with section 184.
Oh, is that what you mean?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
But
And
we are going to sell them by option.
yeah, I always
Well,
say
we're not
do
going to
that
sell
in
them by
public
option, we're
so
going to go by
that,
option.
so you don't have any danger of an elected member or someone associated with an elected member doing something that might land in hot water. So I always say public, but I take Dion's point that in a small community, everybody knows everything, and you might not want to, but then if you're going to do that, your elected members have to, and you're bound legislatively around confidentiality, boy, you better stick to it, because it's going to look bad if you don't. So that's the danger of that in confidence situation.
So we don't review our 90-day debtors as a group. Should we? That seems operational.
Are you talking about normal debtors or rate debtors?
Rate debtors probably.
Yeah.
yours is-
I mean, normal debtors, we don't have the same legislation protection. So we want to keep them under control, but you probably don't have lots of them. Your rates debtors, some councils have it come to council every council meeting, the percentage of rates that are still outstanding. In the end, unless you're in Elliston's situation, we've got those low value properties, it's not really an issue, for it doesn't affect your cash flow, doesn't affect your financials because you get interest off them anyway. Your financials are accrued. Your cash flow statement might be affected, but it's picked up in your balance sheet. It's not the end of the world, but it's something you don't want to completely lose. So different councils have different philosophy, and they might pick them up every quarter in their budget reviews or something like that.
Yeah, where we've, I guess, had to consider it a bit more carefully as we have a bad debt appear in our financials, but we've considered that in confidence.
Rates won't normally appear as a bad debt.
Because-
So general debtors are the only ones that can normally appear because it's a debt on the land with rates and guaranteed, it can never go bad.
Yeah.
Or any Elliston. But where it's a normal debtor, your audit committee should be considering at their meetings where you've got situations where a debtor becomes doubtful and becomes potentially bad.
Mm.
So that should be part of the audit committee, in which case that audit committee agenda and minutes become part of council's information and also in recommendations. Certainly debtors don't have the protection, you do have to be careful, but I've been sending it to the audit committee every quarter. So, and depending on the extent of that debt.
That's all going to change with the audit changes in the coming year.
Oh, yeah, so audit committee changes in the local government reform makes the audit committee a lot more like an audit committee of a legal entity. Our audit committees are very watered down in local government. Even so, it will still be watered down compared to a commercial entity's audit committee.
No,
But
and
it'll be
all
more
that's-
robust than it.
That's all well and good, but I don't know if we can start on dealing with all the time. They can keep throwing all these extra legislative changes on us, but with the same number of staff, it's going to get to the point where it's going to cause critical issues.
It certainly is challenging. We've had a lot of changes in a short time. And it's just challenging keeping up with which changes are coming through each month. And they're coming through every month. So if you look at the marked up version that you can get off the LGA of all the changes and when they come in, it's not been simple to keep track of everything. I mean, the impacts at the moment already are all the elected member behaviour stuff, all the caretaker stuff is about to come in, all the election stuff coming in after, but yeah. So it is really challenging at the moment.
I think on the issue of the 3-year debts, because I know what Councillor Laurie's referring to, we can't really talk about it here. If council believes there's an issue there, there's no reason why we couldn't have a notice of motion to rescind that motion and consider the report in an open meeting this month. I want to reiterate that.
You've got to weigh up risk versus reward. And the only reason, and if your current practice has been to do them in confidence, fine, but just remember the risk of an elected member or an associate of an elected member, because might be discussions at home or something, buying that property.
Not at auction.
Not at auction, like going in and making an approach to that owner. That would be my concern when it's in confidence. But if everyone's behaving the way they should be behaving, shouldn't be an issue. But it is a mix across the state. Some do it in confidence, some don't.
What happens if it goes the other way, the actual owner approached a councillor?
And if I was an elected member, I'd be going, whoa, I'm not touching this.
Because you've got the option of buying at auction anyway.
Yeah, you buy an auction and then it's public
Might be
and
cheaper.
available to everyone.
Yes,
You've got to be really, really careful in this kind of situation because this is ICAPable. Is that actually a word?
Yeah.
Should be.
Yes,
Siri.
This is something that can go to ICAP and be very serious. So this is something you need to be very careful about.
I mean, obviously our hope is that some form of settlement happens before we have to go to auction.
Absolutely.
My 40 years here, I can only remember going to auction on one property, and that was where the property owner wanted us to do it.
And remember the process the lawyers go through. They do searches on the titles and they have to notify everyone with any interest on that title, including the banks. Usually the banks will sort this out well and truly before it goes to auction.
The uncover is by not having it available to the public. That the person approached a councillor or a relative of a councillor and they weren't aware of that their property was getting sold up. There's a problem just here alone. Council should have had it in the public domain.
I think there would have been that many notices and information going to that person in that process that they would be well and truly aware they were facing that.
Notices, phone calls.
Because there's a legal process to go through and notification that has to go through to them before you end up at sale. Well and truly before you end up at sale.
The one I'm talking about is
I did hear of someone who was in jail that missed all that. But that might be an issue, but usually they would do well and truly aware. It's not like they woke up one morning and the hammer guy was out front auctioning. Like, I can't see how that could possibly happen with all the information and the notices and papers and phone calls and everything else that's got to happen.
I'll get back onto the